water pooling at my feet, agony ripping through my spine. I frantically shook the man I'd vowed to love forever. He cracked one eye open, groaned, and shoved my hand away. I have a big presentation, Lily. I need my sleep. That single sentence didn't just end our marriage, it unraveled his entire life. If you had looked at my life from the outside, you would have thought I had it all. I was 29, living in a beautifully restored colonial house in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut, and married to David. David was the kind of handsome that made people stop and stare tall, impeccably dressed, with a magnetic smile that he wielded like a weapon. He was a rising star at a prestigious wealth management firm, a job he had secured largely thanks to a few heavy-handed recommendations from my father, Robert. I've always been a daddy's girl. My father is a self-made man, a commercial real estate titan who built his empire from nothing but grit and a fiercely protective love for his family. Growing up, I watched how my father treated my mother, Susan. He treated her like she hung the moon. If she had a cold, he would leave board meetings to bring her soup. That was my baseline for love. As a daughter, I was raised to believe that a man's true worth was measured by how he showed up for his family when the chips were down. When I first brought David home, my father was skeptical. He looks at himself in the mirror a little too long. Lily, my dad had whispered to me in the kitchen, while David charmed my mother in the living room. A man who loves his own reflection won't have the capacity to truly see you. I brushed off his warnings. I was blinded by the romance, the grand gestures, and the sheer force of David's ambition. We got married, and for the first few years, it was a whirlwind of cocktail parties, exotic vacations, and upward mobility. But the higher David climbed, the more the foundation of our marriage began to rot. The cracks became impossible to ignore when I got pregnant. Instead of drawing us closer, the pregnancy seemed to flip a switch in David. To him, my changing body and the impending arrival of our child were massive inconveniences to his carefully curated lifestyle. When the morning sickness hit, he complained about the smell of saltines in the bedroom. When my ankles swelled and I couldn't attend his firm's agonizingly dull galas, he accused me of not being a supportive corporate wife. By my third trimester, we were essentially living as roommates. He was working incredibly late hours, supposedly preparing for the biggest pitch of his career, a multi-million-dollar account that would secure his path to partner. He guarded his phone like a state secret, flipping it face down whenever I walked into the room. He changed his passwords. He started taking calls out on the patio in the freezing November air. I wasn't stupid. The intuition of a woman, especially a pregnant one, is razor sharp. I suspected there was someone else. A name kept popping up on his caller ID, Rachel, a junior analyst at his firm. Whenever I asked about her, he would gaslight me into oblivion. "You're being hormonal and crazy, Lily," he would sneer, pouring himself a scotch. "Rachel is helping me build the financial models for the Harrison account. I am working myself to the bone to provide for you and this baby, and all you do is nag. God, you're suffocating." I swallowed the hurt because I wanted my child to have a family. I wanted to prove my father wrong. I wanted to believe that once the baby was born, the David I fell in love with would magically return. I spent my days decorating the nursery in soft sage greens and creams, crying quiet tears into the tiny onesies I folded, trying to convince myself that this was just a phase. As my due date approached, David's detachment morphed into outright hostility. We had a birth plan, one that involved him driving me to the hospital, holding my hand, and being the supportive partner I so desperately needed. But he couldn't even be bothered to attend the final ultrasound. He claimed his schedule was simply too tight. My father ended up taking me to that appointment. I remember sitting in the dim room, watching the grainy black and white monitor as my daughter's tiny heartbeat echoed through the speakers. I looked over at my dad. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. He reached out and enveloped my hand in his large, calloused one. "You don't have to settle for crumbs, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my daughter. You were raised for a feast." I cried the whole way home. I knew my dad was right, but I was terrified. I was about to bring a life into the world, and I felt entirely, utterly alone. I didn't know that the universe was about to force my hand, and that David was about to show me exactly who he was in the most brutal way possible. It was a Tuesday night in mid-December. A bitter nor'easter was howling outside, rattling the window panes of our house and dumping inches of heavy, wet snow on the driveway. I was 38 weeks and 4 days pregnant. David came home around 11:30 p.m., reeking of expensive bourbon and something sweet, a floral perfume that definitely didn't belong to me. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He just stumbled into the kitchen, downed a glass of water, and announced he was exhausted. Big day tomorrow, he slurred slightly, not looking me in the eye. The Harrison pitch is at 9 a.m. I need complete silence tonight. Don't wake me up unless the house is literally burning down. He walked into our bedroom, shut the door, and within minutes, I could hear his heavy, rhythmic snoring. I stayed in the living room, trying to find a comfortable position on the couch. Around 2:15 a.m., I felt it. It wasn't a subtle twinge. It was a sharp, blinding pain that wrapped around my lower back and violently squeezed my abdomen. I gasped, dropping the book I was trying to read. I stood up, thinking I just needed to stretch. As soon as I was on my feet, I heard a distinct pop. A warm rush of fluid soaked through my sweatpants and pooled onto the expensive Persian rug. My water had broken. Panic and adrenaline surged through my veins. The contractions were hitting hard and fast, much faster than the birthing classes had warned for a first-time mother. I waddled as quickly as I could to the bedroom and flicked on the glaring overhead light. "David," I gasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "David, wake up. It's time." He grunted, pulling the heavy down comforter over his head. I hobbled over to the bed, the pain blinding me for a second, and shook his shoulder hard. "David, my water broke. The baby is coming. We need to go to the hospital right now." He ripped the blanket off his face, his eyes bloodshot and furious. He looked at me not with concern, not with excitement, but with absolute disgust. "Are you kidding me, Lily?" he barked, his voice dripping with venom. "Right now? It's 2 in the morning. I can't control when the baby comes," I cried out, doubling over as another contraction ripped through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, panting. "Please, get the bags, the keys." David sat up, rubbing his face aggressively. "It's probably false labor. Braxton Hicks or whatever. Just go take a warm bath and lie down." "My water broke," I screamed, pointing at my soaked clothes. "I am in labor!" He stood up, towering over me. The smell of the bourbon, mixed with that sickeningly sweet perfume, hit my nose. "Listen to me," he said, his tone dead, devoid of a single ounce of empathy. "I have the biggest pitch of my entire life in 7 hours. If I don't nail this, I don't make partner. I've been working on this for 6 months. I am not spending the rest of the night sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair in some hospital room watching you scream." I stared at him. The air in the room seemed to freeze. For a second, the physical agony of the contraction was completely eclipsed by the shattering of my heart. The man I loved, the father of my child, was looking at me like I was a pest he couldn't wait to swat away. "You're my husband," I whispered, tears spilling hot down my cheeks. "I need you. I need my sleep," he fired back coldly. He grabbed a pillow and his phone off the nightstand. "Call a cab, or an Uber. Call your overbearing parents. I don't care. I'm sleeping in the guest room, and I am locking the door. Do not disturb me." He walked right past me. He didn't even flinch when I let out a wretched sob. I heard his heavy footsteps pad down the hallway, followed by the definitive click of the guest room lock. I was alone. The contractions were coming every 3 minutes now. Shaking violently, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the only man in the world I knew would never abandon me. My father picked up on the first ring. "Lilybird?" he answered, his voice rough with sleep, but instantly alert. "Dad," I choked out between sobs and agonizing pants. "The baby is coming." David locked himself in the guest room. "He won't take me. I can't drive." There was a silence on the line, a heavy, terrifying silence that only lasted a second, but spoke volumes. In that second, my father processed the betrayal of his daughter. "I am leaving right now," my dad said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register I had rarely heard. "Your mother is getting her coat. We are 10 minutes away. Unlock the front door, sit on the floor by the entryway, and breathe. I've got you, sweetheart. I'm coming." True to his word, 12 minutes later, the headlights of my father's Range Rover cut through the blizzard outside. The front door burst open, bringing a flurry of snow and the freezing wind into the foyer. My mother dropped to her knees beside me, wrapping a warm blanket around my shoulders. her hands gently brushing the sweat-soaked hair out of my face. "Oh, my beautiful girl, you're doing so well," she murmured, crying alongside me. My father stood in the entryway. He looked down the hallway toward the guest room. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated executioner's rage. He took a step toward the hallway. "Robert," my mother said sharply, grabbing his wrist. "Not now. Lily is the priority. The baby is the priority." My dad stopped. He took a deep, shuddering breath, locking his fury away in a box to deal with later. He bent down, scooped my pregnant, trembling body into his strong arms with an ease that shocked me, and carried me out into the storm. We made it to the hospital with barely any time to spare. At 5:42 a.m., surrounded by the fierce, unwavering love of my parents, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. When they placed my daughter on my chest, a profound shift happened inside me. The weak, accommodating wife I had been was gone, burned away by the fires of labor and the cold reality of betrayal. Looking down at her tiny, perfect face, I knew I would die before I let a man like David teach her what love was. My father stood in the corner of the recovery room, watching us with tears in his eyes. After the nurses left to give us privacy, he walked over and kissed my forehead. "She is perfect, Lily," he whispered. Then, he stood up straight, his face hardening into stone. He pulled his cell phone from his coat pocket. "Now," my father said, his voice eerily calm, "I am going to make a few phone calls, because the man sleeping in that guest room has no idea that he just woke up a dead man walking." While I was learning how to nurse my newborn daughter in the quiet, sterile sanctuary of the maternity ward, David was waking up in our guest room. I didn't see it, of course, but I heard all about it later from mutual acquaintances and the deposition transcripts that followed. David woke up at 7:00 a.m., completely refreshed. He took a long, hot shower, shaved meticulously, and dressed in his lucky charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. He walked through the house, completely oblivious to the puddle of amniotic fluid that had dried into the Persian rug in the living room. He didn't check the master bedroom. He didn't call my phone. He assumed I was pouting, perhaps asleep, or maybe I had actually taken his callous advice and gone to the hospital on my own. It didn't matter to him. All that mattered was the Harrison account. He drove his sleek Audi into the city, blasting a motivational podcast, entirely convinced that this was the day he would ascend to the ranks of partner at his wealth management firm, Kensington and Associates. He walked into the glass-walled boardroom at 8:45 a.m. His managing director, Richard, was already there, looking nervous but excited. Rachel, the junior analyst and David's not-so-secret mistress, was setting up the financial models on the projector. She wore a tailored skirt and gave David a knowing, triumphant smirk as he walked in. At 9 a.m. sharp, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened. Arthur Harrison, the billionaire patriarch of the Harrison family, walked in. He was a notoriously tough negotiator, an old-school industrialist looking to park 9 figures of liquid assets into a new management portfolio. But Arthur Harrison did not walk in alone. Trailing right behind him, wearing a tailored navy suit and an expression of pure, unadulterated ice, was my father, Robert. David faltered. His million-dollar smile froze on his face. He blinked, looking from Arthur to my father, his brain desperately trying to compute why his father-in-law was standing in his boardroom. "Robert," David stammered, his voice cracking slightly. What a surprise. I didn't realize you were attending this pitch." My father didn't even look at him. He pulled out a leather chair for Arthur, sat down next to him, and steepled his fingers on the polished mahogany table. Arthur Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Well, David, when a man is about to hand over the management of a massive family trust, he consults his primary silent partner. Robert here owns 40% of the holding company that generated this capital. I don't make a financial move without his blessing. In fact, he was the one who initially suggested we look at Kensington and Associates." The color drained entirely from David's face. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization of his own vulnerability. He looked at my father, perhaps hoping to see the jovial, supportive father-in-law he was used to manipulating. Instead, he saw a predator evaluating its prey. "Proceed with the pitch, David," my father commanded. His tone was barely above a whisper, yet it commanded the entire room. David tried. He really did. but the man was fundamentally shattered by the presence of the one person who could destroy him. He fumbled his words. He lost his place on the slides. When he tried to explain the risk-adjusted return metrics, his voice shook so badly that Richard, his boss, had to intervene and try to salvage the presentation. Rachel clicked frantically through the slides, her previous smirk replaced by a look of sheer panic. After 20 agonizing minutes, my father raised a single hand. Silence immediately fell over the room. "This is amateur hour," my father said flatly. He turned to Richard, ignoring David entirely. "Richard, I brought you this account because you promised me elite management. What I am looking at is a disjointed, poorly researched mess presented by a man who clearly lacks the focus, integrity, and stamina to manage my family's wealth. Robert, I assure you, David is our top guy." Richard backpedaled, sweating profusely. "Your top guy?" My father finally turned his gaze to David. The contempt in his eyes was absolute. "Your top guy is a coward. A man who abandons his heavily pregnant wife in the middle of a blizzard because he needs his sleep is not a man who can handle pressure. A man who spends his evenings exchanging inappropriate emails with his junior analyst." My father paused, glancing coldly at Rachel, who visibly flinched instead of doing his due diligence on a 9-figure account, "is a liability." The boardroom was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Richard stared at David, horrified. "What is he talking about, David?" "He lacks character," my father continued, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "And in my world, character is the only currency that matters. Arthur, we are leaving. Kensington and Associates will not be seeing a dime of our money. In fact, I am pulling my own personal portfolios from this firm by the end of the business day." "Wait, Robert, please," Richard begged, chasing my father toward the door. "We can fix this. We can assign another partner. We can terminate those responsible." My father paused at the door, looking back at David, who was gripping the edge of the conference table, hyperventilating. "You clean house, Richard," my father said coldly. "And maybe, just maybe, my lawyers will pause the withdrawal of my assets. Good day." The doors shut. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. Within 10 minutes, David was pulled into Richard's office. There was no severance package. There was no quiet resignation. He was fired for gross misconduct, breach of company ethics, and jeopardizing the firm's most vital client relationships. Security was called to escort him to his desk to pack his things. In a panic, David turned to Rachel. He pulled her into an empty hallway, practically begging her for support. "Rachel, it's okay. We can start over. I have contacts. We'll go to another firm." Rachel looked at him like he was a stranger. The allure of the powerful, wealthy, older mentor was gone, replaced by the pathetic reality of a disgraced, unemployed man. "Are you insane?" she hissed, stepping away from him. "You lied to me. You said you were legally separated. And now you just blew up my career too. Richard is looking for any excuse to fire me to appease your crazy father-in-law. Do not ever speak to me again." She spun on her heel and walked away, leaving David standing in the hallway holding a cardboard box of his belongings, completely and utterly alone. It was not even noon, and the empire he thought he had built had turned to ash. While David's professional life was being publicly executed, I was in a cozy, sunlit hospital room holding my daughter, whom I named Audrey. My mother was brushing my hair, humming softly, while my dad sat in the armchair in the corner, typing quietly on his phone. When David finally turned his phone on, he had kept it off during the pitch to avoid distractions. It exploded with missed calls, but none of them were from me. He had voicemails from his screaming mother, who had just heard the news of my emergency delivery from my parents, and a text message from a prominent local law firm. In a state of shock, David drove back to our house in Connecticut. He thought he could at least come home, manipulate me, shed a few crocodile tears, and blame the pressure of his job. He thought I was the same subservient girl he had left crying in the hallway at 2 a.m. But when he pulled into the driveway, his key wouldn't turn in the front door. The locks had already been changed. Sitting on the front porch was a man in a sharp gray suit, Mr. Gallagher, my father's most ruthless divorce attorney. Next to him were 4 large, impeccably packed suitcases containing all of David's clothes and personal belongings. "Mr. Gallagher?" David said, his voice trembling as he walked up the steps. "What is this? Where is Lily? You can't just lock me out of my own house. Mr. Gallagher stood up, adjusting his tie calmly. He handed David a thick manila envelope. I am serving you with divorce papers on behalf of my client, Lily. Included is a restraining order prohibiting you from coming within 500 yards of her, her parents, or her newborn daughter, Audrey. This is my house, David yelled, his face turning red. Actually, it isn't, Mr. Gallagher replied smoothly. If you recall the postnuptial agreement you signed 3 years ago, the one you didn't read carefully when Robert bailed you out of that bad real estate investment, the house belongs entirely to the holding company. Lily is the sole tenant. You have no equity here. David ripped open the envelope, scanning the documents wildly. She can't do this. I have rights. I'm the father. A father who abandoned his wife in the middle of a medical emergency, locking himself in a room while she was in active labor, Mr. Gallagher noted, his tone laced with disgust. We have the taxi logs. We have the hospital admission records. We have the sworn testimony of both her parents. A judge will look at your conduct, combined with your recent termination for unethical behavior, and you will be lucky if you get supervised visitation on alternating holidays. David collapsed onto the steps, burying his face in his hands. The reality of his choices crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. I just needed my sleep, he whispered, a pathetic defense that sounded even more ridiculous in the stark light of day. Well, David, Mr. Gallagher said, gesturing to the suitcases, you'll have plenty of time to sleep now. The divorce was not a battle. It was a slaughter. David tried to hire a lawyer to fight for alimony and a piece of my family's trust, but no reputable attorney in the tri-state area wanted to go up against my father's legal team over a disgraced broker with no income. David's reputation in the financial sector was radioactive. Word of what happened in the Harrison pitch spread through the tight-knit Wall Street community like wildfire. No firm would touch him. The man who once sneered at me for not being a supportive corporate wife ended up having to sell his beloved Audi just to pay for a tiny, depressing apartment on the outskirts of Newark. The last I heard through the grapevine, he was working at a mid-tier regional bank, selling basic life insurance policies, and barely making quota. His charm had faded, replaced by the permanent bitterness of a man who knew he had held the world in the palm of his hand and crushed it through his own vanity. Rachel, true to her nature, married a senior partner at another firm 6 months later and blocked David on every conceivable platform. As for me, I thrived. The first few months of single motherhood were exhausting, terrifying, and beautiful. I didn't return to the colonial house. It held too many ghosts. My father helped me buy a stunning, light-filled condo overlooking the water, a place that felt entirely mine. I surrounded Audrey with love, laughter, and the unwavering support of my parents. I watched her take her first steps, heard her first laugh, and felt the fierce, protective love that only a mother knows. I went back to school, finishing a degree in interior architecture that David had once mocked as a frivolous hobby. Today, I run my own boutique design firm, creating spaces that feel safe, warm, and authentic. Looking back, the night my water broke was the worst night of my life. The physical pain was blinding, but the emotional betrayal was a wound that I thought would never heal. But trauma has a funny way of stripping away the illusions we cling to. David's cruelty that night didn't destroy me. It set me free. It shattered the illusion of the man I thought I loved, allowing me to see the absolute strength of the woman I actually was. Sometimes, a brutal ending is the only way to get a beautiful beginning. I just had to wake up from the nightmare to see it. Wow, what a roller coaster. If Lily's journey from heartbreak to absolute empowerment resonated with you, hit that like button to show your support. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately set you free? Tell me your story in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and subscribe for more real-life drama, twists, and stories of epic comebacks. See you in the next one.